I would have a patient in front of me. They would have an injury that I knew how to fix or how to treat. I would have a prescription from their doctor that agreed with, the treatment that I wanted to provide for them. In my other hand, I would have the brace that I wanted to fit them with. And I wouldn't be able to put that brace on that patient because the insurance company, someone hundreds of miles away, who didn't see either the patient or the prescription, is telling me that they aren't willing to pay for that patient to have that product.
Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome back to Scaling Practice Management, the podcast that helps practice managers grow smarter, not harder. Brought to you by Talkie AI, your AI voice agent for medical front desk teams. My name is Jakub Greitsar. I'm your host for today, and my guest is Angela Presley, Program Manager for Healthcare Accelerators at Dartmouth College. Angela, I'm so excited to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing great. It's a nice spring Tuesday here, so I'm looking forward to the flowers popping up out of the ground for me.
Yeah, it's getting much, much better here in Poland as well. Sometimes I drive with, Uber drivers here in Poznań, and they're from various countries, sometimes from Africa, and every time they mention that the weather is just, Polish winters are, part of not the best part of living here, but Polish spring is great, and Polish summer is not soon after, so, everybody's gonna be happy about that. Anyway, super excited to have you on the show here, Angela, and I really like the topic that we have lined up for today. We'll be talking a little bit about managing change and making sure that the innovation that's already there in terms of new technologies actually gets implemented at healthcare practices. That's coming up, but before we get there, I wanted to let the audience know you a little bit more from the personal side. So, Angela, my first question to you is, what is the most fun thing you've done this year thus far?
Sure. I mentioned the flowers because that's top of mind for me right now. Within the last 2 years, my husband and I bought an old farm and we're fixing it up. And the property came with tons of flower beds that were all overgrown, and I've been rehabbing them. So I've been pulling out all the old weeds, and the spring is the rewarding time for all of that. I can start to see things popping up, and I'm really excited to see all that hard work pay off.
Yeah.
The property has been, another kind of job for both of us, but it's really fun.
Like a cool little side project, or maybe not so little, actually. So what are you growing there?
Mostly just flowers, although this used to be a strawberry farm, so there's a lot of
Oh.
strawberries around, and a nice big patch for a vegetable garden too.
Okay, awesome. That's super, super nice. Yeah, I think a lot of people listening to this are gonna relate. We only have just regular plants. I'm a fan of air plants. Have you ever had those?
Yeah, I have never had those. I think that would be challenging. Are they hard to raise?
No, not really. I mean, the part where they don't need soil is what attracts me to them because that makes it a little bit easier, right? So that kind of tells you how much I'm into plants, which is to say, very much a novice, very much a novice. But air plants, I recommend them. They're cool. I
All
didn't know
right,
they
I'll have to
existed
try
up
it.
until a few years ago. Anyway, so thanks for sharing that. And then the next one, so myself, I started at Talkie, the company behind the show, a few months ago, right? And previous to that, I was not in healthcare. When I was being recruited, I got this question: why do you want to get into healthcare? What's attractive to you about this space? And I figured as I meet more and more people from this space through this show, I would ask the people coming on the show as well. Angela, how did that happen that you were connected to the healthcare space? Was it always the plan? Was it an accident? How did it go?
I think it was an accident. I love puzzles and solving problems, and that's what I think keeps me interested in medicine. Um, Anywhere that I can sort of sink my teeth into and find a space that hasn't been fully solved, then I'm hooked. So I think my very first introduction to anything medical was when I was a little kid, watching my mom, who was a basketball coach, tape her athletes' ankles on the sidelines. And I used to go and run and bring her the med kit and the tape. And that was kind of my very first entry into anything medical. And it's really funny because that sort of set the trajectory for the rest of my career too.
Okay. Okay. That's really cool. So, did you play basketball yourself?
I did play a little basketball in high school, but as soon as I was, a late teenager, I started working in the athletic training office,
Hmm.
and so helping to fix athlete injuries, from the time I was 16 all the way through college, and so that ended up being my kind of first clinical setting, right from,
Okay.
that childhood exposure through my teenage years and then all the way through college.
Okay. Really interesting. So, if that was the beginning of the journey, could you tell the watchers and listeners a little bit about where you are now and what you're working on currently?
Yeah, I actually don't see patients anymore. Um, as the leader of healthcare related accelerator programs, I work with clinicians as they bring their innovations into practice. So it's actually been, I think, 6 years since I have actually treated a patient myself. And there are parts of it that I miss, but still kind of being connected to the healthcare industry, specifically on the innovation side, still scratches that itch for me, I think, at this point.
Okay. So that puzzle itch, was it?
Yeah. So that kind of concept of here's what we have, how can we make it better? I still get to do that. So I still enjoy that part of things.
Okay, I like that. And I think a lot of our conversation is going to be about that. So, first, I wanted to, as we get immersed in the topic at hand, I wanted to ask you the question that every guest gets at almost the very beginning of the show. And that is, what is your number one tip for scaling a medical practice, for growing in the space?
I think growing in this space, at least from my observations, seems to really require a genuine connection with the patients and the patient satisfaction not being an afterthought, but being the foundation for the practice seems to really be the thing that you can't live without. And practices will organically grow when patients truly believe in the care that they're receiving and in the kind of compassion and the human connection with the caregivers that they interact with as well.
Yeah, caring for the patient is definitely close, or should be definitely close to top of mind for practice managers. I wonder if you know of any particular tactics, strategies, or tools that you've seen that work to improve this satisfaction, something or any new things that practice managers should be aware of that are on the horizon for this?
One of the new things that I'm optimistic about is the integration of AI into workflow. So I think that will provide a little bit of space for the clinicians to do what they're good at and for the other folks in practice to do what they're good at and then to take some of the kind of repetitive drudgery tasks off their plate. And so that lets the human be more human for that kind of connection. And the technology can hopefully lift some of their burden and just allow them to have a little breathing space for a conversation. They get a chance maybe to get a drink of water in between patients or just the things that help us be better equipped to give of ourselves. Um, that should provide a better experience for everyone.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're mentioning that. This brings to my mind the concept of this like social emotional battery, or just you've got a set amount of energy for a day. And if you're working at the front desk, for example, because that's the part of the system that we help at Talkie, if you're constantly the phone is constantly ringing off the hook, you constantly have to answer questions or juggle multiple calls at once. uh and the questions can sometimes be really basic, like, are you open on Sundays? Can I pay by card? And
Yeah.
that's the kind of drudgery, the menial kind of work that can be offloaded to an AI, so it can take care of the people who are at the clinic in person, seeking help or anything like that. So I'm glad you're mentioning that.
Yeah, very often we are interacting with people who are already having a bad day. They're sick, they're hurt, they're not at their best, and that's why they're coming to see us. And so we have to be at our best to be able to kind of compensate for that in order to meet in the middle and have it not be like a volatile situation. Otherwise, you end up with frustrated patients and frustrated staff, and that combination just can be really toxic. So I think anything you can do that helps lift that burden in the background is really helpful.
Okay, okay. really glad you mentioned that, and we'll dig into this more in a second. Could you share a little bit more about, your day to day and what you do at Dartmouth? So just so the watchers and listeners can have a little bit more context of, what's the main work that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah, I lead accelerator programs that have to do with healthcare and medicine. And the current programs that we're running are related to cancer products, anything to do with the treatment or diagnosis of cancer, and then also a digital health program. So innovators can enter our programs. They have to be affiliated with the college or the hospital in some way. And the faculty leads a team of usually 2 or 3 people, usually grad students, sometimes undergrad students are on that team. And they come with an idea that they've already had. Usually it's an idea that's founded in their bench research. They get given um, all of this really detailed scientific input from the academic side of things, and they have an idea that it can be the seed for a product that they can bring into real life. But those two worlds are really far apart usually. And so we help them just kind of bridge the world of the lab to the world of the clinic and think about that product that they've done maybe years of research with, what it needs to look like in the real world. So we help them think through things like, what's the regulatory process going to be? What kind of evidence do the stakeholders within the clinic need in order to adopt something new? How will you make money? Are you going to sell this thing yourself as a startup company, or are you going to license it to a different strategic company? What's your kind of path? And just planning those things out, it's usually a totally different mindset than they have had within their career up to this point. So we're just introducing some of those questions and helping them think that through. And the feedback that we've gotten is that actually returns back to the lab and helps them change their basic science with this kind of flavor of what kind of things make it into the real world. Maybe we should ask those types of questions in our lab and focus more on that. And so we're not trying to change kind of the pursuit of just knowledge for knowledge's sake, but we're trying to inject into that a little glimpse of what does it look like when translated into the world.
And I think that's an extremely important problem to solve, especially in the healthcare space. I remember when we were chatting a little bit before we started recording, you mentioned this concept of I remembered it as a 20-year gap
Yeah.
between when a new technology is conceived of or developed and before it's adopted. Can you say a little bit more about that, and why do you think this gap is so large?
Yeah. I'm not the one that coined the 20-year gap phrase, and so I don't actually know how it
Ah.
originated, but I do think it's about right, that it takes something like 10 to 20 years for a new idea that has been kind of scientifically vetted to make it into traditional mainstream workflow within the clinic. I think part of that 20-year gap is the educational cycle that happens in healthcare. So the instructors and the people who are experienced enough to be teaching in med schools and residencies, they they're comfortable with the equipment that was around when they were practicing, and it's been 10 years since they were, first started out. And so then they instruct their students, and then by the time those students get to the point where they could possibly be instructors, we've got that kind of 20-year cycle going. I think that kind of explains some of it. And then another thing that contributes to that is the um, recent emphasis on evidence-based care. So we are very reluctant to integrate anything that doesn't have a really strong evidence base, and it takes years to generate that evidence base. So you may have, you know, a round of clinical trials that suggests that this product is safe and effective, but maybe they want to observe patients after they have used the product for 5, 10 years. And then again, you have that multiple year gap coming through. It's a gap that we don't see in other parts of technology. And as innovation in the rest of technology accelerates and healthcare kind of remains the same at this 20-year gap, the difference between expectation and reality gets wider and wider apart. So you have this kind of funny phenomenon where, in the clinic, it's still totally normal to use a fax machine and a pager on a daily basis. Whereas if you did that in any other sector, people would laugh at you, right? They'd be like, the 1980s are calling. Um, we're
Faxing,
stuck
right?
we're stuck in that track because that's what the current workflow calls for. And of course things are going to change slowly over time. We're going to transition to using our cell phones that we're already carrying anyway. But by then, who knows where the standard tech will have advanced to.
Yeah, the doctors will be using smartphones when we're gonna have, I don't know, AI-enabled glasses, maybe?
Right, maybe.
Exactly. I hear that. So I'm building a picture, right, of all these things that are leading to this gap, all the roadblocks. Some of them, on the face of it, seem unavoidable. Maybe they can be mitigated, but can't be really avoided. You need to run tests, and you probably should observe the effects of certain medicines over even a few years' time. On the other hand, you mentioned regulations, you mentioned education. So, to simplify, which of these roadblocks do you find the most personally frustrating in the sense of, oh, I can't believe that we're still dealing with this and it still takes so much time? And which do you feel are the most urgent for us to change?
The one that I used to run into all the time when I was in clinics, so I worked in orthotics and prosthetics after athletic training. I used to run into problems with reimbursement all the time. So, this is the type of scenario that would happen. I would have a patient in front of me. They would have an injury that I knew how to fix or how to treat. I would have a prescription from their doctor that agreed with, the treatment that I wanted to provide for them. In my other hand, I would have the brace that I wanted to fit them with, and I wouldn't be able to put that brace on that patient because the insurance company, someone hundreds of miles away, who didn't see either the patient or the prescription, is telling me that they aren't willing to pay for that patient to have that product. So it really felt like they were imposing themselves on what would be otherwise a really seamless patient care visit, by saying, nope, I'm sorry, we don't cover that particular thing that you want to provide. You're going to have to use something else that's subpar for that patient because that's what we're willing to pay for. And so that kind of sense of frustration, that disconnect between what I could do and what I was actually able to do for financial reasons for a patient was very jarring to me. And that kind of has stuck with me and kind of throughout every stage of my career. That's been the thing that I'm trying to fix. It doesn't seem right to me that someone who is so far from the actual situation can dictate the care that's given.
You know, the podcast we're doing here, it's aimed primarily at practice managers, and I really believe a lot of them are nodding to what you're saying right now, that it's happening at their practices too, and they're feeling this reimbursement delay. So have you found anything that actually works as a fix for this, or are there ways to mitigate this?
I tried a bunch of things throughout my career. So the first thing I tried was I went and got a PhD in biomechanics. And again, because I was in the bracing sector, I was going to do a bunch of studies that showed that these products were effective, and study the movement changes that it created in the patient. And then I thought maybe if I publish enough of those studies, I've created a large body of evidence. Then the insurance companies surely will have to change their mind, and that was the way to affect change. But it turns
I'm
out that's
sensing
not.
a touch of sarcasm there.
Yeah. Turns out that's not really that wasn't helpful. That wasn't what they were interested in. Because what they're interested in is kind of a body of evidence that again is like 20 years worth of evidence. And one lone researcher kind of shouting your results into the void is not going to change the decision making of the folks who are holding the purse strings. And so what I did after that, and I think actually does have a little glimmer of hope, is this working with innovators to actually change the way that their products are designed. And so I think by changing the specifications of the products themselves and making them more realistic for the clinical framework that they have to be used within, that's kind of where the path of hope is. We're looking at small incremental changes from what the current status quo is, instead of these huge disruptive leaps. And I think getting momentum towards change seems to be more important than trying to make a huge jump from 1 to 5.
Interesting. Could you explain this a little bit more to me? The part about innovators. Okay, here's how I understood it initially, and please fill in the gaps, because there's bound to be some. So instead of trying to introduce, let's say, a new type of brace that needs to be approved again or tested again? Is it about improving the already approved current types of braces, but just making them slightly better? I'm coming back to your example. Or is this something else? What does it look like in practice?
Yeah, so there's two things. There's the kind of changing the specifications of the product to fit within the framework, which is the first way that you described it. And then the second thing is to change the framework, right? Change the structure of healthcare in order to be more accepting to innovation. And I think change has to happen on both of those levels, but you have to recognize the amount of inertia that you're going up against, which is huge. And so you have to praise and be excited about just even small incremental steps in the right direction, from both sides. And hopefully soon we'll meet in the middle, and that 20-year gap might be whittled down to a 10-year gap or a 5-year gap, and I would count that as a win.
Okay. So I can understand conceptually improving the products.
Mhm.
You're talking also about improving the overall structure around it, the way the system works, so to speak. So what can be done there?
So, an example would be, on the reimbursement side of things, the insurance companies use a tech review process where they look at a new product, um, and they determine if there's enough evidence for them to cover it. They use the system for pharmaceutical products the same way that they use it for device products. And that doesn't really work. And as devices are getting more and more advanced, the disconnect is getting worse and worse. So an example is their current standard of care is that you have to have a double blind study. So the patient doesn't know what type of product that they're using. And it's really hard to blind a patient to a device as opposed to a drug, because you can just use a placebo pill for a drug. For a device, you still have to have something that you have that patient interact with. So you end up with kind of lower, what they would consider a lower standard of evidence because they're using the same standard across both sectors. What you could do to fix that is they could have a standard for a digital product, a standard for a non-digital product, and a standard for a pharmaceutical product. So just by kind of slightly changing their expectation for the evidence that's generated, they'll find that a lot more evidence is acceptable to them.
I understand. So, okay, this question might be a little bit silly. So I'm wondering, is there a community, an association, or is there a movement to try and make these types of changes happen? What I mean is, I'm again trying to look at this from the perspective of a practice manager, right? So I
Yeah.
might not be able to directly affect this change, to try to change the system, but somebody's doing it and I want to support them. Who do I support?
Yeah. So the practice managers do have an option when they come to their annual negotiation with the insurance companies each year. So during that process, they decide, which products will be paid at which level for the insurance company. And there's a little bit of back and forth negotiation that happens. Um, if they want to prioritize a certain category of product, for example, they could request a more lenient coverage uh, from the insurance company for that category. And then they could also, there has to be a give and take. So they could say, we're really interested in providing this that you currently don't have coverage for, this treatment set here. But we would be willing for this set to not be covered for our particular patients. So some of that will happen over time, and that's as the individual clinic negotiates with the insurance company. It also can happen at the professional organization level. So within every subspecialty, um, within medicine, there are professional orgs that manage the certification and accreditation of those people. They're the ones that publish the practice guidelines, and they kind of just define what is current practice. Um, if the review cycle for those practice guidelines was to be compressed and they were to look at the current standard of care more often, then they may recommend newer things as the standard of care, because they would be able to consider things that have come out within the last few years instead of every 5 years or every 10 years like their current cycle is now. And then once those professional organizations are on board with a treatment or a product, um, they have quite a bit of sway as kind of the key opinion leaders within that sector. And their standard practice guidelines are one of the things that get taken into account for coverage.
This makes me feel really good. I may be overthinking it here, or maybe assigning too much significance to just our humble little podcast, but I imagine somebody might be listening to this and thinking, hey, I know where to go to at least do a little bit, at least do my part to try and make innovation happen faster. And we're talking specifics. I really like that. So I did want to switch gears for a second here, though, because at the same time, just as there are innovation enthusiasts, there might be skeptics, right?
Mhm.
So one thing I wanted to ask you is, what would you say to a person who says that there's a reason why this innovation happens so slowly? The primary principle is do no harm, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So trying to accelerate that might pose some risks. What would you say to a person like that?
Yeah, I agree. I actually think that some degree of delay is healthy. And we've seen the consequences of when a proper amount of care was not taken. There are some examples of, drugs that were released that turned out to be harmful, or things like that that have happened kind of in the history of medicine. That first do no harm principle is near and dear and really, driven into the minds and hearts of anybody who's in medicine. That cautious perspective makes sure that you have enough evidence to base your decisions on. In tech, especially in kind of deep tech in the digital world, there's an expression where they say, let's move fast and break things. And that's the kind of idea where they're trying to just get something done as quickly as possible in order to be as disruptive as possible. And that's how technology takes huge leaps forward. But that only works when the downside is small, when the risk profile is acceptable. It's not small when you have a human life on the line. And so I think that is very important to acknowledge that it's possible that you could, slow down someone's recovery or even create harm to that person if you don't take the precautions that are necessary. So there's a balance to be said there between like excessive red tape and just accelerating without any type of brake pedal.
Okay, but I guess your kind of message would be that still this balance is right now swung too much in the direction of it's still a little bit too slow.
Yeah, and I think what you can use as the measuring stick for that is if you look around, I'm in the med tech sector. So if you look at the number of companies in this sector, there's kind of a handful of big companies that are successful, and then there's a whole bunch of startups. And those startups have a really high failure rate. And the failure is not usually driven by the product failure, it's driven by the commercialization failure. So they have something that could work if they could actually sell it and get it in people's hands and get it to the bedside of the patients. But the pipeline is broken, and so they can't get there. And so those companies end up going defunct, and their idea sits on a shelf somewhere and gathers dust. And the possibility of that innovation helping patients is lost, which is a real shame. So I think what needs to be done is there needs to be a little bit more of a bridge between those small startups, those, someone who thought of something in their garage, and then the huge multinationals that are really responsible for most of the devices that are currently available. And part of that gap, at least in my mind, is that payment problem. So if things can get paid for, even if they are relatively new and innovative for that patient, then that provides a lifeline for those smaller companies so that they can survive and that their products can survive.
Right. I guess we're thinking of different parts of the cycle, right? We're not necessarily talking about rolling out broadly stuff that's been unproven, but when it is proven and the only issue or the only blocker or the delay is on the payment and reimbursement side, that seems to be something that's really salient as something to address. I get that. I understand that. All right. So the next thing I wanted to ask you about is kind of immersing ourselves a little bit in the internal life of a practice.
Mhm.
Just as a practice manager might be a little bit skeptical towards change and innovation, so too can the staff. And I wonder if you have any tips for somebody who might be leading a practice who's really keen on innovation, but's facing again, to give a little bit of an example from the Talkie side, we help the front desk team, right? But it's still an AI being introduced into a team's life, and not everybody is enthusiastic about that. There's a little bit of trepidation around, how is this going to affect my job, etc. Or it's just change, right? It's just change, and people are a little bit scared of change each time. So, did you have any advice on how to handle situations like that?
Sure. I've been in several clinics where some change has been implemented, kind of from on high, and then we've had to adjust accordingly. And I've definitely been one of those people with a bad attitude about something new coming through. So I've been on kind of both sides of that equation in the past. Something that helped in my personal experience was letting up on the performance expectations during the period of transition. So for a little time, there probably will be duplication of effort when you're bringing something new in. And so you'll have to do things the old way and the new way just to make sure that nothing gets missed and lost. And so if you have to see as many patients as usual, but you're having to do twice the work, everyone's going to be scrambling and it's going to not be a pleasant experience. So just having a lower patient volume expectation for the first week of launch, or just letting people maybe have 2 days a week where they use the new workflow and 3 days a week where they use the old workflow allows them to kind of catch up and de-stress in between. Those kind of things that allow a more gradual transition seem to be really helpful. And in my experience, what people are primarily concerned about, especially folks who are on the admin side and maybe not the direct patient care side, they're concerned about their KPIs. So whatever is being used as the kind of outcome measure for their success may not be adjusted when their tools are adjusted. And so they're having to, in order to meet the same standards that they had to meet before, they're having to really emphasize a different part of their job than is actually their strength set. So I think whenever a new workflow or new tool is introduced, then the objectives for that department also need to be evaluated. And everyone needs to make sure that they agree on how performance is going to be measured with those new tools in order for everything to smoothly transition.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. It brings to my mind, and I know this does not translate 100% to the medical space, but the idea of hackathons, for example.
Mhm.
So, right now I'm in the marketing space, right? So we are also looking at what we can get done with AI, but we also have a ton of ongoing work. So what we try to do, every once in a while is okay, we shut things down for a day or 2 days and we run a hackathon, right?
Yeah.
This again might not always be possible for a medical practice, but like you said, 3 days to 2 days or some other ways to just create space for it, carve out time, or at least lower the pressure for results for a time as this transition happens, because the results on the other end of it might be much, much better. But you don't know that until you give it a fair and honest shot.
Yeah, and I also think, like, recognizing the sources of friction is very helpful. So, ignoring anybody's complaints or just saying, "Well, you just don't like change and that's why you're having trouble," um, is not constructive. But if people can say can kind of get together and say, "Here's what I've noticed that's different, and this is what's bothering me, or this is what I like," that does seem to really help. It kind of helps with the camaraderie within the workforce. And it also helps with just problem solving. So somebody else might have experienced the same thing that person has experienced with this new tool, and they may have already discovered a workaround or something that they use to solve that issue. And so just getting people together, again, giving them time to kind of connect on that human level and say, okay, things are different. As humans, we have this reluctance for change. How can we embrace this, or what can we do to make this better for you? Is hugely helpful.
I like that. Did you have any other advice? Because I was intending to make it one of the main parts of our conversation, the issue of change management, right? And obviously you can break it down into various other sub problems. Is there one we haven't touched upon as of yet that you also think is worth looking at, particularly for practice managers where they might hit snags on how to deal with them?
I like to put any type of proposed change into the framework of the Quadruple Aim. I don't know if that's something you've heard of, but
No, I
there's
haven't.
kind of 4 different ways to look at healthcare change. One is that you're improving the patient's outcome, the healthcare outcome. Another is that you're improving the staff's quality of life. Another is that you're making more money for the practice. And so each of those kind of aspects of that aim can account for why the change is coming through. Um, and I think if you kind of quantify those things for people, that really helps them justify what they're currently going through. So they get a look at the end goal and they say, now that I have the big picture, I understand that there's a little bit of give and take here. And although I have to do these 3 extra steps in my workflow, the patient outcomes are showing improvement. And so I'm willing to do that. Or I understand the impact on the bottom line for me to make this adjustment. And I understand the motivation for admin wanting this to happen. I think any kind of context like that is also very helpful. The resistance to change that usually happens because someone feels like the juice isn't worth the squeeze, and that may be because they don't fully understand the situation.
So I'm trying to stick to the metaphor here. The juice needs to be understood through the lens of not just what happens for the staff, but also for the patients, but also for the bottom line of the practice. And yeah, I think it goes back to just sound business advice. The more you can plug your people into how what they do affects the business in general, help them see the big picture. That can be really motivating for some people, that they see that there's a real impact that they might not see in their day-to-day work, but it does translate to whether the company can grow, whether it creates new opportunities for them, right? And hey, the name of the show is scaling practice management, right? So,
Yeah.
so
And
that can lead to greater
that's one
scale.
of the roles of a good manager, right? Is to translate that down the line. Like, you don't need to show the whole spreadsheet to everybody, but just being open in your communication at a high level is enough. And the folks who have a need to know of the details can, understand it within whatever context you need them to understand.
So here's a question that I've been really looking forward to asking you. So I was leaving it kind of for later. So I assume you've seen a lot of these potential innovations in the healthcare space. And I was just wondering if you would be able to point to one or two or three, some of the ones that you are feel the strongest about, like once we get that implemented in the healthcare space is going to make such a big difference. You can't wait until this particular technology or solution crosses the threshold and actually gets implemented. Do you have anything in the back of your mind that fits that definition?
Yes. So it's a broad class though. It's the miniaturization of tech that I'm the
Mm-hmm.
most excited about. So I think in general, just in the same way that computers have gone from taking up a whole room to now being acceptable, on your phone in your pocket. Um, Medtech hasn't really done that as quickly, because we haven't been motivated to do that. Because if we have a hospital that's already full of these large, bulky machines, the space is already accounted for. There's no reason to have a portable version. But I'm really excited about higher levels of care, being able to move outside of the hospital and into the satellite clinics, and then maybe even eventually into the patients' homes. And as things are kind of cheaper and smaller and able to be made mobile, especially in terms of monitoring technology and wearables that people can now have on their body that can provide some of the detailed diagnostic data that we previously could only get from a lab setting. I'm really excited for that transition to happen. So we can now know what's going on with a patient, between appointments, which was previously a totally blank space. And so we had these kind of 3 or 4 data points where we had really detailed data about what was going on with that person and no idea what was going on in between. And now we're finally getting to the point where things are miniaturized and cheap enough that the patient can have a small version of that device within their home. They can use it maybe once a day or once a week, and give us a more complete picture of what's going on with them. And our diagnoses and treatment are going to change drastically when we have that improved picture. Because there's so much more data that's going to be coming in from those more frequently collected data points, um, then you need management of large data sets, which is something that we haven't done in the past. But AI has the capability of doing it. And so now that we can take humans out of the number crunching, the combination of those two things of technology getting smaller, cheaper, portable, and of AI being able to process that increased data set is going to be really powerful.
Do you know that so far, I've recorded a few of these episodes already, and so far, this has been mentioned every time.
Really?
Wearables, more data, and then crunching that data using AI. Like so far, 100% of my guests have mentioned this. So definitely the excitement for that must be there. Uh, I wanted to
That's
take you into
hilarious.
the. Yeah, I know.
What's funny though, what's interesting is that the reimbursement for that process is somewhat there, but not all the way there. And so that's once again going into our theme of what's holding back change. That's going to be one of the things, one of the sticking points that's going to stop that from being adopted across the spectrum.
Somewhat there. That makes me cautiously optimistic, at least a little bit, right? But it's easy.
So there
Yeah.
there is currently a reimbursement process for very cheap sensors that it pays about $50 a month for a sensor, but a lot of the things that people would take home with them might cost $100 or $1,000 a month, and currently there's no way for that to be paid for.
I understand. So I'm trying to build a picture in my mind. Could you be more specific about what kinds of machines currently we only see at clinics and hospitals that we might be soon seeing at home? I want to see this vision of the future that you're building.
Sure. I'll give you an example from my PhD segment. So biomechanics is this the topic, and there used to be these things called gait labs that were located, throughout the country. Um, Specifically, they would do a lot of gait analysis on children who had cerebral palsy. And they would do an analysis before surgery, and then they would do a surgery where they would adjust tendon lengths and muscle lengths so that that patient could walk better. And then they would do a gait analysis after surgery to see how much was changed. Now we have the ability to have pressure sensitive insoles that that patient could wear at home, and maybe some um, IMU wearable sensors that could be strapped to their legs, and they could just go about their daily life. They could run around in the playground or whatever it was that that kid was going to be doing that week. We can gather their gait data, and we can know how it changes as they grow. Instead of just knowing, maybe once a year or every 5 years that they would have come into the gait lab. And that can really help to inform. You can watch that data carefully until you see a change that's alarming, and then you say, okay, now it's time for surgery. Or maybe we don't need to have surgery because I actually see that this is improving as the patient moves.
And the data from that, out of curiosity, does that need to be somehow passed on to the clinic, or can they, day to day actually look at what's happening? I guess my question is it online? Is it in the cloud already?
Yeah, so well-designed products have a dashboard that has a patient-facing component and a clinician-facing component. And so the patient-facing component, in this example, the child with cerebral palsy and their parents can maybe look on their cell phone and say, "Oh, you took, 1,000 more steps today than you did yesterday, and your gait speed was a little bit higher, and I see that your range of motion is looking like you are progressing more towards the optimal range. We must be doing something right. Let's keep going with your physical therapy or wearing your braces or whatever the intervention was." Or they can do the same thing and say, "Uh-oh, I'm starting to see a worrying trend. Let me make an appointment with your doctor." Meanwhile, on the doctor's side of things, the patient can call and say, "Hey, I'm a little bit worried about, my child's data. I want to come in and have a checkup." And the clinician can look at their dashboard and say, "Oh, I agree. Look, I'm seeing a trend that seems a little bit worrying." They might have, a level higher detail. And they would be able to say, "Okay, yes, now is the time for you to come in, and it looks like you should come in within a month, or we should get you in tomorrow," based on how concerning the trend is.
So, this brings to my mind. So, this is the third podcast I'm running. My first podcast was interviewing CTOs. My second podcast was interviewing marketing agency leaders. And now I'm in this healthcare space and running this podcast. And yet, what you're mentioning here is a through line through almost all of my conversations thus far. Whether I was talking about building technology or managing people or running marketing, everybody was saying the same thing. And the thing was close the feedback loop. That is the most important thing that you can do. And I'm seeing that in what you're saying here as well, is if you have the data, if you can actually get the feedback, almost in real time or day by day from this device, then that helps you make such better decisions over time. And it's amazing to me how so much of what we're trying to do is to just get better data to create better feedback. So I just, I thought that connection was really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. And hopefully this will change the way that clinicians are trained. Again, it's going to take that delay, of it getting into reality and then working its way through the training system. Um, but if they're not used to having this much data, then they're not used to that much decision support. And so there may be resistance where they say, oh, my professional judgment is actually superior to the evidence that I see in front of me. And so I'm going to just do, what I normally would do with the normal amount of data that I would have. And I'm going to choose to ignore all this other stuff. Or they can say, I'm going to take my professional judgment and my background and I'm going to adapt it to this new level of exposure to data that I have. And I'm going to have to reevaluate some of my traditional choices. And it's hard when you have a level of professionalism and a level of comfort with that existing workflow to make that change. And I think we're kind of in that turnover point right now where people are trying to decide what to do about it. Hopefully, the next generation of clinicians will be raised to think of this data as a support to them. It kind of gives them superpowers instead of something that challenges them.
Would you have any piece of advice? We're kind of getting to the end of our time here, unfortunately, because the conversation has been really inspiring, to be honest with you. I'm trying to think. So I have a hypothesis, right? And the hypothesis is anybody who's in the healthcare space, whether a practice manager, a clinician, anybody who's part of this whole machine, if they can improve their, calling it productivity is almost too shallow. Their personal effectiveness, their openness to change, openness to learning new things, but also how much they can get done in a day. So quite broadly, effectiveness. Anything we can do to improve that will be beneficial to the outcomes, ultimately the outcomes of the patients, right, and the healthcare of the society at large. Would you have any pieces of advice for any of that to try and improve the effectiveness of healthcare professionals? This can be, not to steer you too much, right? But some people talk about tools, some about frameworks, sometimes it's a mindset thing. What would be your selected thing for that?
I think it would be in the category of tools. And I think what might need to happen is that some of the old tools need to make way for some of the new tools. Because what has currently happened is that things just get added on. So, if you're working in a clinic and seeing patients, you may have 20 different logins that you have to keep track of for the different dashboards and online portals and things that you have to access for patient care. And similar to kind of the pager messages that happen, overhead in the intercom, soon it just becomes noise. And so you have to be able to prioritize and simplify and decide which things you're going to pay attention to and which things have to go by the wayside. So figuring out a tool set that is actually the core tools that are needed for today's climate, I think will really help with that innovation process. Ideally, what will happen is that there will be suites of tools that will be released that can all kind of talk to each other and integrate and reduce some of that burden. We're right now we're in the friction point where things are changing over. And so I'm expecting that it'll be there'll be some growing pains for the next few years as more of that data is integrated into the old workflows.
Yeah, I actually think you're hitting on something really important here. Integration is extremely important. We've even found, in our conversation at Talkie, we're talking about introducing this new tool, and the AI picks up the phone instead of your medical front desk and collects the information. They can call patients back, etc. But one of the first questions we get is, okay, but is it another platform to log into? Is it another app to go into? Do I have to go there separately and move the information from the platform to my EHR? And that's why we're really focused on integrating with particular EHRs, so then we can reply Nope. They call you and it goes right into Athena 1 or right into ModMed or right into Elation Health, right into one of these platforms. And that's where it seems like, they can see the real effectiveness and productivity benefits there. So yeah, having one interface for it seems like a really good move. So I'm glad I asked the question. Thank you for answering that. And that was honestly the last one that I had for today. I do feel like there's room for more conversations here. And did you mention this was your first podcast experience?
Oh, yeah, but I've done a lot of webinars in the past, so I
Yeah,
feel like this
yeah.
is kind of like that.
Yeah, I'm finding that hard to believe, honestly. I hope some other podcast hosts are going to listen to this and have you as a guest so I can listen to more of your insights on other shows. Because my time is unfortunately almost up. As my last question, I wanted to ask you where you would like to direct our watchers and listeners to follow you, or where should they go to get more from you?
I do a lot on LinkedIn. So I do a lot of reposting of kind of current news stories, especially in terms of regulatory and reimbursement. So if that kind of thing interests you, you could come follow me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, that's great. I'm a big LinkedIn fan. Partially even joined Talkie through my LinkedIn presence, so I can recommend it. And Angela is a great follow, so definitely go and do that. On the flip side, if you want to get more of scaling practice management, you can follow me as the host, Jakub Greisar. I'm on LinkedIn as well. You can follow Talkie.ai. We'll be posting excerpts from the show, new episodes there as well. And you can go to Talkie.ai, our website, and sign up for our newsletter. That should be live by the time I'm publishing this episode. You should be able to sign up, and you'll get our vault of content. So our articles, podcasts, webinar recordings, all in one place, so you can get easy access to everything we have to share about improving healthcare outcomes from our library of content. So that will be the the action that you can take from our side. If you're watching this on YouTube, definitely subscribe and leave a like and a comment. Oh, it's so nice that I get to say that. Anyway, Angela, this has been such an inspiring conversation. I learned so much from it, and I think the watchers and listeners could take a lot away from this too. So thank you so much for finding the time and for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I had a great time.
Yeah, me too. And as for you watchers and listeners, thank you so much for joining us here today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.